Tonight, we're stepping into one of the most turbulent, brutal, and fascinating periods in all of human history. Forget the romanticized legends of noble warriors and brilliant strategists. Forget the epic tales of loyalty and brotherhood you might have seen in movies or video games. The truth about the Three Kingdoms period of China, spanning from 220 to 280 CE, is far darker than any Hollywood adaptation could capture. This was an era when nearly 3/4 of China's population vanished, when disease swept through villages like wildfire, when warlords carved up an empire with rivers of blood, and when simply being born meant facing odds of survival that would terrify even the hardiest among us today. Imagine waking up not to an alarm clock, but to the distant sound of drums signaling another military levy. The air carries the smell of cooking fires mixed with something fouler, something you try not to think about. Your stomach aches with hunger, as it has for weeks. Outside your wooden hut, the fields stretch toward a horizon marked by columns of smoke. Another village burning. Another warlord's army passing through. You're 20 years old, which means you've already outlived many of your childhood friends. Your hands are calloused and scarred from endless labor in the fields. Your teeth, what remain of them, ache constantly. A persistent cough has plagued you since last winter, and you know, somewhere deep down, that it might never leave. Welcome to the Three Kingdoms era. Let's talk about why you wouldn't survive it. The collapse, when an empire crumbled. To understand just how dangerous life became during the Three Kingdoms period, we need to rewind to the years just before, to the final gasps of the once mighty Han Dynasty. The Han had ruled China for 4 centuries, creating what many historians consider one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history. At its height, around the year 2 CE, the Han Empire encompassed approximately 58 million people, according to imperial census records, living across a vast and prosperous realm. Trade flourished along the newly opened Silk Road. Cities thrived. The arts and scholarship reached extraordinary heights. Chinese civilization seemed invincible, eternal, but empires, no matter how grand, carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. By the mid-2nd century, cracks had appeared in the Han's foundation. At the imperial court in Luoyang, power had shifted away from the emperor and into the hands of court eunuchs. These castrated officials, who served as intermediaries between the emperor and his court, gradually accumulated enormous influence. Emperor Ling, who took the throne in 168 CE, became little more than a puppet. The eunuchs enriched themselves through corruption, selling government positions to the highest bidder, and skimming taxes meant for the imperial treasury. The real work of governance ground to a halt. Officials who should have been maintaining dikes, organizing grain reserves, and managing provincial affairs were instead focused on factional struggles and personal enrichment. As the central government weakened, nature struck, emerged with devastating force. The Yellow River, that great artery of northern China, began flooding with increasing frequency and severity. Millions of peasants lost their homes and fields. Forced to migrate south, They created a massive labor surplus, which landowners immediately exploited. Wages plummeted. Working conditions deteriorated. The gap between rich and poor, already substantial, became a chasm. Then came the diseases. Starting in 171 CE, epidemic outbreaks began appearing across China with alarming regularity. Contemporary records mention major disease events in 171, 173, 179, 182, and 185 CE. Some modern historians have speculated that these may have been manifestations of the Antonine Plague, a pandemic that had devastated the Roman Empire between 165 and 180 CE, though this connection remains uncertain and debated among scholars. If the diseases were connected, the pathogen, likely smallpox or measles, could have traveled along the Silk Road, carried by merchants and travelers who had no understanding of contagion or quarantine. When disease reached China, it found a population with no immunity whatsoever. The death toll was staggering. Contemporary accounts describe entire villages being wiped out, families losing all their children in a matter of days, the sick lying in the streets, too numerous for the living to bury. China's population, which had reached approximately 58 million during the height of the Han, according to census records, would eventually crash to roughly 16 million by the time the Three Kingdoms period ended in 280 CE, according to Han Dynasty census data. That represents a loss of approximately 72% of the entire population over the course of a century. Let that sink in for a moment. Nearly 3 out of every 4 people in China died or disappeared from the historical record during this period. Now, it's critically important to understand that warfare alone didn't cause all these deaths. The dramatic census discrepancy between late Han, approximately 56 million, and early Jin, approximately 16 million, reflects multiple factors. Census-taking systems broke down completely during the chaos, making accurate population counts impossible. Many people fled to regions outside imperial control where they weren't counted. Massive numbers died from disease, famine, and warfare, and the Jin census was far less comprehensive than the Han census had been. While scholars debate the exact causes and proportions, the scale of demographic catastrophe, whether through death, displacement, or uncounted populations, was undeniably immense. Into this cauldron of disease, natural disaster, and government corruption stepped a man who would change Chinese history forever. His name was Zhang Jue, and he offered something the desperate masses craved more than anything: hope. Zhang Jue was a Taoist healer who claimed to possess miraculous powers. He told the suffering peasants that their illnesses came from sin, but that through confession and faith in his teachings, they could be cured. He provided them with blessed water infused with burned talismans, and when some people recovered, his reputation spread like wildfire. Zhang Jue founded a religious movement called the Way of Supreme Peace, or Taiping Dao, and sent his disciples throughout northern China to spread his message. The movement grew with astonishing speed. Within a few years, Zhang Jue commanded the loyalty of hundreds of thousands of followers. But Zhang Jue's message wasn't only spiritual, it was revolutionary. He taught his followers that the Han Dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule. He proclaimed that the era of the blue sky, represented by the Han, was ending, and a new age of the yellow sky was about to begin. His followers wore yellow scarves or turbans to symbolize this new world, and they prepared for an uprising that would sweep away the corrupt old order. In March of 184 CE, the Yellow Turban Rebellion exploded across China. Zhang Jue, calling himself the Lord General of Heaven, led the uprising with his two brothers coordinating forces across multiple provinces. Historical sources suggest Zhang Jue commanded hundreds of thousands of followers organized into 36 regional divisions, with some accounts mentioning approximately 360,000 rebels, though the exact numbers are difficult to verify from ancient records. His two brothers, Zhang Bao and Zhang Liang, commanded their own forces as the Lord General of Earth and the Lord General of Man. Within 10 days, the rebellion had spread throughout the empire. Rebels attacked government offices, killed officials, pillaged villages, and seized control of entire commanderies. The imperial court in Luoyang found itself besieged on multiple fronts by an enemy that seemed to appear everywhere at once. The Han government responded with overwhelming force, but it came at a terrible cost. To suppress the rebellion, the emperor had to rely on regional warlords and military commanders, granting them enormous power and autonomy. These commanders raised their own armies, controlled their own territories, and answered to no one but themselves. The central government, already weak, lost what little authority it had left. Zhang Jue died of illness in October 184 CE, but the rebellion he started refused to die with him. Yellow Turban remnants continued fighting for 2 more decades, staging sporadic uprisings and joining forces with other rebel movements. The White Wave Bandits, regional rebellions in Qing, Yi, and Yan provinces. Each suppression required military intervention, and each intervention further empowered the warlords. By the early 3rd century, the Han Dynasty existed in name only. The young emperor, a boy named Xian, who had taken the throne at age 8 in 189 CE, had become a pawn passed between various military strongmen. Real power belonged to those who commanded armies, and 3 men, in particular, were about to divide China among themselves and plunge the land into 6 decades of near-constant warfare. Their names were Cao Cao, Liu Bei, and Sun Quan. The warlords, China torn in 3. Cao Cao was a man of contradictions. Born in 155 CE to a family with connections to the imperial court through eunuch patronage, he rose to prominence during the suppression of the Yellow Turban Rebellion. He was brilliant, ruthless, cultured, and terrifying in equal measure. A talented poet who could compose moving elegies one moment and order brutal punishments the next. A military genius who studied Sun Tzu's art of war obsessively and applied its lessons with cold efficiency. A political operator who understood that controlling the emperor meant controlling the empire, even if the emperor himself was powerless. In 196 CE, Cao Cao made the move that would define his career. He convinced the young Emperor Xian to relocate the imperial capital to Xuchang, a city firmly under Cao's control. With the emperor as his puppet, Cao Cao could issue commands in the emperor's name and claim legitimacy for all his actions. Any warlord who opposed him was, by definition, rebelling against the emperor. It was a masterstroke of political theater. But Cao Cao's genius extended beyond politics. He recognized that military power required economic power, and economic power required agricultural productivity. In the chaos following the Yellow Turban Rebellion, vast stretches of farmland had been abandoned. Millions of refugees wandered the countryside with no land to farm and no way to feed themselves. Cao Cao saw opportunity in this disaster. He established a system called Tuntian, military agricultural colonies, where displaced peasants and captured rebels were settled on abandoned land and required to farm under military supervision. The system was brutally exploitative, with farmers required to hand over between 40 and 60% of their harvest to the government. But it worked. Cao Cao's territories became food secure, which meant his armies could campaign year-round without worrying about supply lines. Those armies grew massive. At the height of his power, Cao Cao commanded forces estimated at over 220,000 men, though he sometimes claimed to have as many as 800,000. He used these forces to systematically eliminate his rivals throughout northern China: Yuan Shu, Tao Qian, Zhang Miao, Liu Bei. One by one, Cao defeated them all. In 200 CE, at the Battle of Guandu, he faced his greatest challenge, Yuan Shao, the most powerful warlord in northern China, who commanded forces 5 times larger than Cao's. Through a combination of brilliant tactics, intelligence gathering, and sheer determination, Cao Cao won a decisive victory that secured his control over the north. By 208 CE, Cao Cao controlled the entire North China plain, the agricultural heartland of the empire. He held half of China's population under his authority. He commanded the emperor. He appeared unstoppable. That summer, he launched a campaign to conquer the south, starting with Jing province. When the provincial governor, Liu Bei, conveniently died and his successor surrendered without a fight, it seemed that Cao Cao would indeed unify China under his rule. But 2 men stood in his way. Liu Bei represented everything Cao Cao was not. Where Cao was shrewd and pragmatic, Liu Bei cultivated an image of virtue and benevolence. Where Cao openly manipulated the emperor, Liu Bei claimed to be the last true defender of the Han Dynasty. Born in 161 CE, Liu Bei claimed descent from the Han imperial family, though he grew up in poverty. He rose to prominence through his personal charisma and his ability to inspire deep loyalty in his followers. His sworn brothers, Guan Yu and Zhang Fei, would become legendary figures in Chinese culture. His military strategist, Zhuge Liang, was considered one of the greatest minds of his generation. Liu Bei spent years as a wandering military commander, never quite powerful enough to establish a stable base of power. He served under various warlords, always maintaining his independence, always positioning himself as the righteous alternative to ambitious tyrants like Cao Cao. When Cao Cao's armies swept through Jing province in 208, Liu Bei fled south with his followers, barely escaping with his life after Cao's cavalry caught up with him at the Battle of Changban. The third player in this drama was Sun Quan, Lord of the Southeastern Territories. Born in 182 CE, Sun Quan inherited his position from his elder brother Sun Ce, who had conquered the lands south of the Yangtze River. Sun Quan was younger and less experienced than his rivals, but he possessed something they lacked: a strong naval tradition. His territories controlled China's rivers and coasts, giving him advantages in mobility and trade. He also had the wisdom to surround himself with capable advisors like Zhou Yu, Lu Su, and Zhuge Jin. When Cao Cao's armies approached the Yangtze River in late 208, Sun Quan faced an impossible choice. His advisors were divided. Some urged him to surrender to the overwhelming might of Cao's forces. Others argued that Cao would never truly accept his submission, and that their only chance lay in resistance. Sun Quan chose to fight, and he chose to ally with the man Cao had been chasing across central China, Liu Bei. The alliance between Sun Quan and Liu Bei changed everything. In December 208, their combined forces met Cao Cao's army at a place called Red Cliffs, or Chibi. The battle that followed has become one of the most famous in Chinese history. Historical sources give varying accounts of the army sizes involved. Cao Cao himself reportedly claimed to have 800,000 troops, though modern historians estimate his actual force was probably closer to 220,000, while the Allied forces numbered perhaps 50,000. Regardless of exact numbers, Cao's forces had critical weaknesses. His troops, mostly from northern China, were unaccustomed to southern heat and humidity. They had no experience with naval warfare, and an epidemic disease had broken out among them, weakening their combat effectiveness. Zhou Yu, Sun Quan's military strategist, exploited these vulnerabilities brilliantly. He launched a fire attack against Cao Cao's fleet. According to historical accounts, Cao's ships had been chained together, possibly to provide stability for soldiers unused to fighting on water, though some sources attribute this detail to later fictional embellishments. Regardless, the flames spread with terrifying speed, consuming ships and men alike. Cao Cao's forces broke and fled. The battle was a decisive defeat, one that prevented Cao from ever unifying China under his rule. Red Cliffs established the pattern that would define the Three Kingdoms period. China was divided into three roughly equal powers: Wei in the north under Cao Cao, Shu in the southwest under Liu Bei, and Wu in the southeast under Sun Quan. Each kingdom was powerful enough to defend itself, but not powerful enough to conquer the others. The result was a stalemate that lasted for decades, punctuated by periodic military campaigns that achieved little except adding to the death toll. Cao Cao died in 220 CE without achieving his dream of reunification. His son, Cao Pi, forced Emperor Xian to abdicate and proclaimed himself Emperor of Wei. Liu Bei responded by declaring himself Emperor of Shu-Han, claiming to be the legitimate continuation of the Han Dynasty. Sun Quan initially submitted to Wei to buy time, but in 229 he declared himself Emperor of Wu. The three kingdoms were now formally established. The wars continued. In 263, Wei finally conquered Shu. In 266, the Wei general Sima Yan usurped the throne and proclaimed the Jin dynasty. In 280, Jin conquered Wu and briefly reunified China. But by then, the damage had been done. 60 years of near-constant warfare had devastated the population, destroyed countless communities, and created trauma that would echo through Chinese culture for centuries to come. And if you think reading about these wars sounds grim, imagine actually living through them. Life as a peasant, endless labor and empty bellies. Let's talk about what life was actually like for the vast majority of people during the Three Kingdoms period. Because here's the reality. You weren't going to be Cao Cao or Liu Bei or Sun Quan. You weren't going to be a brilliant strategist like Zhuge Liang or a legendary warrior like Guan Yu. The odds overwhelmingly suggest that if you found yourself transported back to 3rd century China, you would be a peasant farmer. And that meant a life of unrelenting hardship that would break most modern people within weeks. Approximately 90% of China's population during this era consisted of peasant farmers living in small villages. These weren't the prosperous agricultural communities we might imagine. We're talking about collections of perhaps 100 families, clustered together for mutual protection, surrounded by fields that had to be worked from sunrise to sunset just to produce enough food to survive. Your home would be a simple structure, probably made of rammed earth or wattle and daub, with a thatched roof that leaked when it rained. The floor was packed dirt. There was no furniture to speak of, just maybe a raised platform for sleeping and a few storage baskets. The entire family slept in one room, sometimes sharing space with their animals for warmth during winter. Your day began before dawn. There were no alarm clocks, no coffee, no leisurely breakfast. You woke because your body was conditioned to wake, because the rooster crowed, because everyone else was already moving. In the dimness before sunrise, you ate a simple meal of millet porridge or rice gruel if you were lucky, then out to the fields. The agricultural work itself would shock most modern people. Yes, the Chinese had invented the iron plow, which was an improvement over earlier wooden plows. Yes, some farmers had oxen or water buffalo to help with the heavy work. But the vast majority of farming was still done by human muscle power. You bent over constantly, wielding a short-handled hoe, breaking up soil clod by clod. You transplanted rice seedlings one at a time, standing in water sometimes contaminated with sewage or parasites, your back screaming in protest. You carried water in buckets suspended from a pole across your shoulders, making countless trips between irrigation channels and fields. You harvested grain by hand with a sickle, then threshed it by beating it against stone surfaces or by having animals walk over it. Every action required effort that would exhaust a modern person accustomed to ergonomic tools and mechanized equipment. And you did this every day, all day, month after month, year after year. The food situation during the Three Kingdoms period was perpetually precarious. Even in good years, most peasants lived on the edge of malnutrition. Your diet consisted primarily of millet in the north or rice in the south, supplemented by whatever vegetables you could grow in your garden plot. Common vegetables included cabbage, onions, garlic, and whatever wild plants you could forage. Meat was an extraordinary luxury. You might eat pork a few times a year during festivals, if you were fortunate. Fish was more common in areas near rivers or coasts, but even that was rationed carefully. Chicken eggs were valuable and often sold at market rather than consumed at home. This monotonous diet had serious health consequences. You would be constantly hungry, your body craving nutrients it wasn't receiving. Vitamin deficiencies would cause a range of problems: bleeding gums, night blindness, easy bruising, weakness. Your immune system, weakened by malnutrition, would struggle to fight off infections. Your bones would be fragile. Your wounds would heal slowly. And then there was the matter of taxation. The Three Kingdoms governments were, at their core, military machines. They needed vast quantities of grain to feed their armies, which meant extracting as much as possible from the agricultural population. The tax rates were crushing. Under Cao Cao's Tuntian system, farmers on military colonies had to surrender between 40 and 60% of their harvest. Even farmers not in military colonies typically owed substantial portions of their crop to the government. Add to this various labor obligations. You were required to work for the government for a certain number of days each year, either on construction projects or in military service. And you can begin to understand why so many peasants lived in desperate poverty. But here's where it gets even worse. The taxation system assumed you would have a harvest to tax. What happened during bad years? What happened when the rains didn't come, or when they came too heavily and flooded the fields? What happened when locusts descended in clouds that blotted out the sun? What happened when armies marched through your region, trampling crops and requisitioning supplies? You starved. Your family starved. Your neighbors starved. The historical records from this period are filled with accounts of famine. People eating bark stripped from trees. People foraging for roots and grass. People selling their children to merchants who promised to feed them. People who simply gave up, lay down, and died. Some chronicles mention instances of cannibalism during the worst famines, though these accounts are difficult to verify and their extent remains debated among scholars. What isn't debatable is that hundreds of thousands, probably millions, of people died from starvation during the Three Kingdoms period. And if you somehow survived the hunger, if you managed to produce enough food to meet your tax obligations and still feed your family, you still had to worry about the armies. Conscription was a constant threat. The various kingdoms needed soldiers, and they weren't shy about taking them. When a military levy came through your village, young men were rounded up and marched off to training camps. Many never returned. Those who did often came back maimed, traumatized, or sick. But even if you weren't conscripted, the armies could still destroy you. Soldiers needed to eat, and when supply lines broke down, they simply took what they needed from whoever was nearby. An army passing through your region could strip the countryside bare, leaving nothing for the people who actually lived there. Then there were the bandits. In the chaos of the Three Kingdoms period, with government authority fractured and military forces spread thin, banditry flourished. Groups of armed men, sometimes former soldiers, sometimes just desperate peasants who had turned to violence, roamed the countryside preying on anyone weaker than themselves. They stole food, burned villages, kidnapped people for ransom, and committed acts of violence that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. You had no recourse against any of this. No police force to call. No insurance to file a claim with. No social safety net to catch you when you fell. You were on your own. And that isolation, that vulnerability, was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of peasant life during this era. The psychological toll of living under such conditions would be immense. Imagine the constant anxiety, never knowing if this year would be the year your crops failed, if this month would be the month the army came through, if today would be the day bandits appeared on the road. Imagine watching your children grow thin and weak, knowing you couldn't feed them properly. Imagine making the calculation of which child to feed and which to let go hungry, because there simply wasn't enough for everyone. Imagine being forced to sell a son or daughter into servitude just so the rest of the family might survive. Most modern people, accustomed to relative comfort and security, would psychologically break under such conditions long before their bodies gave out. The hopelessness, the grinding daily struggle, the constant threat of catastrophic loss would erode mental health in ways we can barely comprehend. And we haven't even talked about disease yet. Disease and death, the invisible killers. If you somehow survived the warfare, the starvation, and the back-breaking labor, you still had to contend with what was, in many ways, the most dangerous threat of all: disease. The Three Kingdoms period was an age before germ theory, before antibiotics, before sterile surgical technique, before vaccination. Medical knowledge existed, and some of it was remarkably sophisticated, but it was fundamentally limited by a lack of understanding about what actually caused illness and how to effectively treat it. Let's start with the epidemic diseases that swept through China during this period. We've already mentioned the outbreaks of what was likely smallpox or measles that began arriving via the Silk Road in the 170s CE. These diseases, endemic in the Roman Empire and parts of Central Asia, were completely new to the Chinese population. When a disease encounters a population with no prior exposure, and therefore no immunity, the results can be catastrophic. Contemporary Chinese historians recorded that people died in enormous numbers, that entire families were wiped out, that cities became ghost towns, Smallpox, if that's what it was, is a particularly horrifying disease. It begins with fever, headache, and exhaustion. Then comes the rash, starting in the mouth and spreading across the entire body. The rash develops into raised bumps, then fluid-filled pustules that crust over and eventually fall off, leaving deep scars. Between 20 and 40% of people who contract smallpox die, usually from complications like pneumonia or septic shock. Those who survive are often left disfigured and sometimes blind. In a population with no previous exposure, mortality rates could approach 50% or higher. Measles, another possibility, is less deadly but still dangerous, especially in malnourished populations. It causes high fever, cough, runny nose, and a characteristic rash. Complications include pneumonia, encephalitis, and severe diarrhea. In populations with no immunity, measles can kill between 5 and 10% of those infected, with rates much higher among young children. But epidemic diseases weren't the only threats. Everyday illnesses that we barely think about today could be death sentences in the 3rd century. A simple bacterial infection from a cut or scrape could turn into sepsis and kill you. Tooth decay, incredibly common given poor nutrition and no dental care, could lead to abscesses that spread infection to your jaw, throat, and brain. Pneumonia, bronchitis, tuberculosis, all common, all potentially fatal. Gastrointestinal diseases were probably the most common killers, especially of children. When your water source is shared with animals and contaminated with human waste, when you have no understanding of the importance of washing hands, when food spoils quickly in the heat with no refrigeration, dysentery and other intestinal infections become constant companions. Chronic diarrhea leads to dehydration and malnutrition, creating a vicious cycle that kills slowly but surely. Based on archaeological evidence and comparative studies of pre-modern societies with similar living conditions, scholars estimate that child mortality during this period was extraordinarily high, with gastrointestinal diseases likely representing one of the primary causes of death among the young. Parasites were another ubiquitous problem. Intestinal worms, roundworms, tapeworms, flukes infected the majority of the population. These parasites rob the body of nutrients, cause anemia, and can lead to serious complications if left untreated. But treatment required knowledge of herbal medicine and access to the right herbs, neither of which was guaranteed. Most people simply lived with their parasitic infections, suffering from bloating, pain, and the slow drain on their health. So what medical help was actually available? Traditional Chinese medicine during the Three Kingdoms period was sophisticated in many ways. Practitioners understood the importance of diagnosis, the concept of prevention, and the use of herbal remedies. The foundational text of Chinese medicine, the Huangdi Neijing, or Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine, which dated to the Han Dynasty, described an elaborate system of understanding health based on qi, or vital energy, and the balance of yin and yang. Practitioners could perform acupuncture, prescribe herbal formulas, and provide dietary advice. Some of their treatments actually worked. Many Chinese medicinal herbs contain compounds with genuine therapeutic effects. Artemisinin, derived from sweet wormwood and used to treat malaria, is one famous example. Chinese ephedra contains ephedrine, useful for treating respiratory conditions. Ginseng, licorice root, ginger, all have medicinal properties recognized by modern science. But here's the critical limitation. Chinese medicine had no understanding of pathogens. Practitioners believed disease came from imbalances in qi, from external factors like wind or cold or dampness, from emotional disturbances. They didn't understand that many diseases were caused by microscopic organisms. This meant their treatments, even when they provided symptomatic relief, often failed to address the underlying cause of illness. Surgery existed, but was primitive by modern standards. Chinese physicians could set broken bones, lance abscesses, and perform some tumor removals. The legendary physician Hua Tuo, who lived during this period, was said to have performed abdominal surgery using anesthesia made from wine mixed with herbal drugs called mafeisan. However, Hua Tuo became a semi-legendary figure, and some of the stories attributed to him may have been embellished over time. What we can say with certainty is that surgical intervention was rare and dangerous. Without antiseptic technique, post-operative infections were common and usually fatal. Pain management was limited. Acupuncture could provide some relief. Herbal remedies could dull pain to some degree. But for serious injuries or chronic conditions, you simply suffered. Broken bones that didn't heal properly would leave you with permanent disabilities. Arthritis, extremely common among people who performed hard physical labor their entire lives, was treated primarily with herbs that reduced inflammation but couldn't stop the progression of the disease. Childbirth was particularly dangerous. Based on what we know about pre-modern societies with similar living conditions, maternal mortality rates during this period were likely quite high, perhaps as high as 1 to 2% of all births. That might not sound like much until you realize that women during this period typically had multiple pregnancies. Over a lifetime, a woman could face a 5 to 10% cumulative risk of dying from pregnancy-related complications. Babies died even more frequently. Drawing parallels from other pre-industrial societies, infant mortality rates likely exceeded 25%, meaning that 1 in 4 babies born never reached their first birthday. Mental health problems received little understanding or sympathy. Severe depression, what we would now recognize as PTSD from warfare or trauma, anxiety disorders, all were interpreted through the lens of spiritual imbalance or possession by malevolent spirits. Treatment might involve rituals, prayers, or herbal sedatives. People who suffered severe mental illness were often cast out from their communities or confined by their families. Life expectancy during the Three Kingdoms period was shockingly low. Based on demographic studies of similar pre-modern populations and the limited census data that survived, scholars estimate that the average person who survived childhood might live to their early 30s or 40s. Making it to 50 was an achievement. Reaching 60 made you an elder worthy of respect and deference. Very few people lived to 70 or beyond. This meant that everyone you knew was likely to die young. Your parents would probably die while you were still in your 20s or 30s. Many of your siblings wouldn't survive to adulthood. Your spouse might die in childbirth or from disease, forcing you to remarry if you could. Your children faced terrible odds of surviving to adulthood themselves. Death was an ever-present reality, not an abstraction, but a constant companion. The grief, the loss, the knowledge that any day might be your last, or the last of someone you loved. This would hang over everything. And unlike in our modern world, where we can sometimes insulate ourselves from the reality of mortality, in the Three Kingdoms period, death was visible, immediate, and unavoidable. Hygiene and sanitation, living in filth. Now let's address something that might seem less immediately life-threatening than war or disease, but was actually a critical factor in survival: hygiene and sanitation, or rather, the lack thereof. If you traveled back to the Three Kingdoms period, one of the first things that would assault your senses would be the smell. The overwhelming, inescapable smell of human and animal waste, of unwashed bodies, of rotting food, of smoke from cooking fires, all mingling together in a miasma that would make a modern person retch. Let's start with the most basic question. How did people bathe? The answer is complicated. During the Han Dynasty, just before the Three Kingdoms period, there had been established customs around bathing. Government officials were granted a day off every 5 days specifically for bathing. The Rites of Zhou, a text describing idealized practices, recommended that people wash their hair every 3 days and take a full bath every 5 days. Wealthy households had private bathrooms where they could heat water and bathe in relative comfort. But that was during peacetime, when the government functioned normally and resources were available. During the chaos of the Three Kingdoms period, such regular bathing became a luxury most people couldn't afford. Heating enough water for a bath required significant fuel, usually wood or charcoal, which became increasingly scarce as armies requisitioned supplies and forests were cleared for military purposes. A peasant family struggling to survive would prioritize using fuel for cooking food, not heating bathwater. So how often did the average person actually bathe? Probably rarely. Maybe once a week if they were lucky and diligent. Maybe once a month if resources were scarce. Some people might go months without a proper bath. Instead, they would wipe themselves down with cloths dipped in cold water when they could spare it, or with rice water if they had any. But with no soap as we know it, this did little to remove the layers of grime, sweat, and bacteria that accumulated on skin. Actually, that's not entirely true. During the late Han Dynasty, an early form of soap emerged called bath bean, or zaodu. It was made by grinding up peas or beans and mixing the powder with spices, flowers and sometimes ground jade or other luxury ingredients. This created a mildly abrasive powder that could help remove oil and dirt from skin. But bath bean was expensive and primarily used by the wealthy. The common people, if they used anything at all, might have access to a simpler version made just from ground beans without the expensive additives. The lack of regular bathing had serious consequences. Your skin would be perpetually dirty, creating an ideal environment for bacterial infections. Lice would infest your hair and clothing, causing constant itching and potentially spreading diseases like typhus. Fleas would bite your body, leaving itchy welts and potentially transmitting plague. Scabies, a condition caused by parasitic mites burrowing into your skin, would make you itch so intensely you couldn't sleep. And everyone around you would have the same problems, because parasites spread easily in crowded conditions. Dental hygiene during the Three Kingdoms period was virtually non-existent for most people. The wealthy might clean their teeth by rubbing them with their fingers dipped in salt, or using primitive toothbrushes made from willow twigs. But the average peasant had no access to such luxuries. You might rinse your mouth with water after eating, if you thought about it. But that was the extent of oral hygiene for most people. The result was predictable. Nearly everyone had terrible teeth. Cavities were ubiquitous, gum disease was common, abscesses formed, causing excruciating pain and potentially life-threatening infections. By middle age, many people had lost numerous teeth, making it difficult to chew food properly and further contributing to malnutrition. Bad breath was universal, though since everyone had it, perhaps people barely noticed. Now let's talk about one of the most unpleasant topics: how people dealt with human waste. In cities, wealthy households might have private latrines, essentially pits dug into the ground, sometimes with wooden seats placed over them. Some cities had public toilets, basically communal buildings with rows of seats over channels that might be flushed with water if the city had a good water supply system. But the vast majority of people, especially in rural areas, had no such facilities. Peasant families typically had a designated area somewhere near their home, maybe a screened-off corner of the yard where they would squat to defecate. In winter, when going outside was unpleasant, some families kept chamber pots inside that would be emptied in the morning. But there was no toilet paper as we know it. The wealthy might use cloth or silk that could be washed and reused. Common people used whatever was available: leaves, sticks, stones, or cloth rags if they had them. Human waste wasn't just disposed of randomly. In agricultural societies, feces was actually valuable as fertilizer. Chinese farmers had long practiced what's called night soil collection. Human waste was collected and composted, then spread on fields to enrich the soil. This actually worked quite well from an agricultural perspective. The problem was that it created numerous opportunities for the spread of disease. When you handle human waste without proper sanitation, when you spread it on fields where food is grown, when that food isn't washed thoroughly before eating, parasites and disease organisms find their way into your digestive system. The eggs of intestinal worms survive composting and remain infectious. Bacteria that cause dysentery and cholera can contaminate water supplies if latrines aren't properly located away from wells and rivers. The cycle of infection becomes self-perpetuating. Water sources were another major sanitation problem. Most people got their water from wells, rivers, or springs shared by the entire community. These water sources were rarely protected from contamination. Animals drank from them. People washed clothes in them. Runoff from fields fertilized with night soil could seep into them. In villages without good drainage, standing water attracted mosquitoes that spread malaria and other diseases. Very few people during the Three Kingdoms period understood the connection between water quality and disease. They might notice that certain water sources made people sick more often and avoid them if they had alternatives, but they had no concept of water purification beyond letting it settle to remove visible sediment. Boiling water to kill pathogens was not a common practice, though some medical texts did recommend it in certain contexts. Most people simply drank whatever water was available and hoped for the best. Living conditions inside homes contributed to the sanitation problems. Remember, the typical peasant dwelling was small, poorly ventilated, and often shared with animals. Chickens, pigs, or goats might be kept inside during cold weather to provide warmth and protect them from theft. This meant animal waste inside the living space, along with the fleas, mites, and other parasites that infest animals. Smoke from cooking fires had no proper chimney, filling the house and coating everything in soot. Food scraps attracted rats and mice, which brought their own diseases and parasites. In cities, conditions could be even worse because of the population density. Garbage disposal was haphazard at best. People might dump refuse in the streets, in rivers, or in designated dump areas. Rats thrived in urban environments, spreading disease wherever they went. During the Three Kingdoms period, with so many cities besieged, occupied, or abandoned, basic services like refuse collection often broke down completely. The overall lack of hygiene and sanitation meant that your body, throughout your life, would be engaged in a constant battle against infection and parasites. Your immune system would be constantly activated, trying to fight off the endless assault of pathogens. This chronic immune activation is exhausting for the body. It drains resources, causes inflammation, and probably contributed to the generally poor health and short lifespans of the era. For a modern person transported back to this time, the adjustment would be almost unbearable. We're accustomed to clean water from taps, to flushing toilets, to soap and shampoo, to washing machines and clean clothes. The realities of Three Kingdoms era hygiene would be shocking, disgusting, and ultimately dangerous to our health. Within days, you would be dirty in a way you had never experienced. Within weeks, you would probably have lice, intestinal parasites, and various skin conditions. Within months, if you survived that long, you would just be one more disease-ridden peasant trying desperately to stay alive in a world that seemed designed to kill you. Social hierarchy and class. Knowing your place. Let's talk about social class, because if the physical hardships of Three Kingdoms life wouldn't break you, the rigid social structure certainly might. Imagine being born into a world where your entire life's trajectory was determined at birth, where social mobility was almost impossible, and where stepping out of line could result in brutal punishment. That was the reality for the vast majority of people during this period. Chinese society during the Three Kingdoms era was organized into a strict hierarchy based primarily on birth and occupation. At the very top were the aristocracy, powerful families with connections to the imperial court, military commanders who controlled armies, and high-ranking government officials. These were the Cao Caos and Liu Beis of the world, though even among the elite there were gradations of power and influence. The truly powerful lived in luxurious compounds, ate fine food, wore silk clothing, and commanded the labor and loyalty of thousands. Below the aristocracy were the Shai, or scholar officials. These were educated men who had passed the civil service examinations or who came from families with scholarly traditions. They staffed the government bureaucracy, advised rulers, and maintained the Confucian traditions that underpinned Chinese civilization. The civil service examination system had been established during the Han Dynasty and theoretically offered a path for talented individuals from lower classes to rise in status. But in reality, passing the exams required years of intensive study, which meant you needed wealth enough to afford books and tutors and to forego productive labor while you studied. Most scholar officials came from families that were already at least modestly wealthy. Next came the farmers. And this is where it gets interesting, because farmers theoretically held a higher social status than merchants. Confucian philosophy valued those who produced things of concrete value, and farmers produced food, the foundation of civilization. In theory, farmers were respected. In practice, especially during the chaos of the Three Kingdoms period, they were exploited mercilessly. You could be respected in principle while starving in reality. Artisans occupied a similar position to farmers in the social hierarchy. These were craftspeople, carpenters, blacksmiths, potters, weavers, and other skilled workers who produced goods society needed. Like farmers, they actually made things rather than just trading them, which gave them a degree of respect. But also, like farmers, this theoretical respect didn't translate into wealth or comfort. An artisan might spend decades perfecting their craft and still live in poverty. At the bottom of the social hierarchy, below even farmers and artisans, were merchants. This seems strange to modern capitalist sensibilities, but Confucian philosophy viewed merchants with suspicion. They didn't produce anything. They just moved goods from one place to another and profited from the transaction. They were seen as parasites who got rich off others' labor. As a result, merchants faced legal restrictions. They weren't allowed to ride in carriages in some jurisdictions. They couldn't wear silk. Their sons were often barred from taking the civil service examinations, trapping merchant families in their low status across generations. And below the merchants, people who weren't even fully part of the social hierarchy: servants, slaves, criminals, and social outcasts. Slavery during the Three Kingdoms period was complex. It wasn't the chattel slavery of the American South, but it existed in various forms. War captives could be enslaved. People who committed certain crimes might be sentenced to slavery. Desperately poor people might sell themselves or their children into bondage just to survive. Slaves and servants had essentially no rights. They could be beaten, killed, or sold at their master's whim. For many, slavery or servitude was a life sentence passed on to their children. Here's the truly crushing part about this social structure. You couldn't escape it. If you were born a peasant, you would die a peasant, and so would your children and grandchildren. Yes, theoretically, someone could study for the civil service exams and rise in status. But the reality was that you had no time to study. You were working in the fields from before dawn until after dark. You had no money to buy books, which were expensive and rare. You had no access to teachers. And even if you somehow managed to become literate, which very few peasants did, the exams were extraordinarily difficult, covering 9 major texts that took years to master. The class system wasn't just about economics or occupation. It permeated every aspect of life. The clothes you could wear were regulated by law. Peasants wore rough hemp clothing. The wealthy wore silk. The colors you could wear, the style of your hair, the size of your house, the type of funeral you could have, all were determined by your social class. Stepping outside these boundaries could result in punishment. Women existed in an even more restricted world. Confucian philosophy, which dominated educated Chinese thought, placed women firmly under the control of men. A woman was subordinate first to her father, then to her husband, and finally, if widowed, to her oldest son. This was called the Three Followings, or Sun Quan. Women of the lower classes worked alongside men in the fields, but they had no legal rights of their own. They couldn't own property. They couldn't initiate divorce. If a woman's husband died, she was expected to remain unmarried and serve her in-laws for the rest of her life. Remarriage was technically possible, but socially stigmatized. Women of wealthy families had slightly more comfort, but even less freedom. They were expected to remain secluded within their homes, emerging only for special occasions. Their primary value lay in their ability to produce sons. A woman who failed to produce a male heir could be divorced. Female infanticide, the killing of newborn girls, was practiced in some areas, particularly during times of famine when families couldn't afford to feed all their children and prioritized sons over daughters. During the Three Kingdoms period, with its constant warfare and social chaos, the normal rules of society often broke down, but this rarely benefited ordinary people. Instead of creating opportunities for upward mobility, the collapse of order usually meant that the powerful became more predatory and the weak more vulnerable. Warlords seized land from peasants. Bandits robbed and killed with impunity. Women faced increased danger of assault and kidnapping. The social protections that had existed during more stable periods dissolved, leaving individuals at the mercy of whoever was stronger. For a modern person, suddenly finding themselves in this society, the lack of agency would be perhaps the most psychologically difficult aspect to bear. We're accustomed to the idea that we can improve our circumstances through hard work, education, or entrepreneurship. We believe in individual rights and personal freedom. The rigidity of Three Kingdoms era social structure would feel suffocating. You would have no control over your own life, no voice in governance, no legal protections worth mentioning. You would exist to serve those above you in the hierarchy, and that would never change no matter how hard you worked or how talented you were. Violence, law and punishment, a world without mercy. We need to talk about violence, because if you thought modern life was dangerous, the Three Kingdoms period would redefine your understanding of danger. This was an era when human life had limited value, when violence was commonplace, and when the legal system, such as it was, operated on principles that would horrify modern sensibilities. Let's start with the most obvious source of violence: war. We've already discussed the military campaigns and major battles, but we haven't really examined what warfare meant for ordinary people. When armies moved through a region, they didn't politely requisition supplies with payment and receipts. They took what they needed. Soldiers broke into homes, seized grain stores, confiscated livestock, and sometimes burned what they couldn't carry to deny it to the enemy. If you resisted, you might be killed. If you didn't resist, you still might be killed. Armies didn't consist entirely of disciplined professional soldiers. Many soldiers were conscripts dragged from their farms, poorly trained, resentful, and brutal. Others were former bandits or criminals who had been given a choice between execution and military service. These men had few qualms about using violence to get what they wanted. Rape was common during military campaigns. So was murder. Historical accounts mention soldiers massacring entire villages suspected of aiding the enemy. Cao Cao himself allegedly ordered scorched earth policies, commanding that entire regions be depopulated and destroyed to deny resources to his rivals. The process of conscription itself was often violent. Military recruiters would arrive at a village and demand a quota of young men. If the village couldn't produce enough volunteers, men would be taken by force. Families might hide their sons, but if caught, the penalties could be severe. Some men mutilated themselves, cutting off fingers or toes to make themselves unfit for military service. The fact that people were willing to permanently maim themselves rather than serve in the army tells you everything you need to know about how dangerous and horrible military service was. But even in peacetime, violence saturated daily life. Banditry was rampant throughout the Three Kingdoms period. Groups of armed men roamed the countryside, preying on travelers and isolated communities. Merchants traveling to market went in armed groups for protection. Villages tried to organize militia for defense, but poorly trained and equipped farmers were no match for experienced bandits. If you traveled any significant distance, you had to accept that you might be robbed, injured, or killed. Many people simply never left their immediate area because the risk was too great. The legal system provided little protection. In theory, local officials were supposed to maintain order and dispense justice. In practice, especially during the chaotic Three Kingdoms period, local government often barely functioned. Officials were corrupt, taking bribes to overlook crimes, or punishing innocent people to meet arrest quotas. The concept of due process, as we understand it, didn't exist. Confessions were extracted through torture. Punishments were brutal and public, designed to terrify the population into obedience. The spectrum of punishments available to authorities would shock modern sensibilities. For minor crimes, you might receive a beating with bamboo rods, not a gentle swat, but a brutal thrashing that left you bruised and bleeding, sometimes causing permanent injury. For more serious crimes, punishments escalated quickly. Amputation of feet, hands, or noses marked criminals and made them outcasts. Castration was used as punishment for sexual crimes. Facial tattooing permanently branded criminals. For major crimes, rebellion, treason, serious theft, the death penalty was applied liberally. But execution wasn't quick and merciful. Public beheading was common, designed as a spectacle to intimidate observers. Strangulation was another method. In some cases, particularly heinous crimes might result in more elaborate executions designed to maximize suffering. Slow slicing, being torn apart by carts pulling in different directions, or being buried alive. Sometimes punishment extended beyond the individual to their entire family. This concept, called collective punishment or group responsibility, meant that if you committed a serious crime, your parents, siblings, spouse, and children might also be executed or enslaved. The logic was that family members should have prevented the crime or reported the criminal. The practical effect was to create a climate of mutual surveillance and to magnify the consequences of any action deemed criminal. You might think that if you simply obeyed the law, you would be safe from these punishments. But the problem was that the law was often arbitrary and unevenly applied. What counted as a crime could depend on the whims of local officials or the political situation. Supporting the wrong warlord, even unknowingly, could get you executed as a traitor. Criticizing government policies could be grounds for punishment. Failing to meet tax obligations could result in imprisonment or forced labor. And then there was the matter of revenge and feuds. In a society where the legal system couldn't be trusted to deliver justice, people often took matters into their own hands. If someone wronged you or your family, you might seek revenge directly. This could escalate into blood feuds that lasted generations, with each act of revenge prompting another. The historical records mention powerful families engaging in vendettas that resulted in hundreds of deaths. For women, the threat of violence was particularly acute. Women had essentially no legal standing and could be beaten or killed by male family members with little consequence. A husband who suspected his wife of infidelity could kill her. A father who felt his daughter had dishonored the family could kill her. And these actions, if they happened within the family, were often considered private matters that the authorities wouldn't investigate. Sexual violence was common and rarely punished. A woman who reported rape faced social stigma and often wasn't believed. If the rapist was powerful or came from a wealthy family, he would likely face no consequences at all. Lower-class women were particularly vulnerable. A woman traveling alone might be assaulted. A woman working in the fields might be attacked. And with no recourse to justice, women simply had to endure this reality. Children weren't spared from violence either. Corporal punishment of children was not only accepted, but encouraged as a way to instill discipline and respect. Beating children with sticks was normal. Starvation as punishment was practiced. Children could be sold by their parents, killed if the family couldn't afford to feed them, or abandoned to die of exposure. Some historical sources from various periods of Chinese turmoil contain accounts of cannibalism during the most extreme famines. Though these claims are exceptionally difficult to verify and may reflect propaganda or exaggeration as much as actual practice. For a modern person transported to this era, the sheer brutality of daily life would be one of the hardest things to endure. We're accustomed to a world where violence, while it certainly exists, is generally condemned and prosecuted. We have police to call, courts to appeal to, and social norms that, however imperfectly, protect us from the worst abuses. In the Three Kingdoms period, you would have none of these protections. You would be utterly vulnerable, and that vulnerability would shape every decision you made, every interaction you had, every moment of your existence. The psychological toll, living with constant fear. We've spent considerable time discussing the physical dangers and hardships of life during the Three Kingdoms period. The disease, the starvation, the brutal labor, the violence. But we haven't fully addressed what might be, for many modern people, the most unbearable aspect of this era: the psychological and emotional toll of living under such conditions. Think about what stress and anxiety feel like in your own life. Maybe you worry about money, about your job, about relationships. These worries can be consuming, affecting your sleep, your mood, your physical health. Now imagine that instead of worrying about making rent or meeting a deadline, you were worried about whether you and your family would have enough food to survive the winter, whether the sickness that's been going around the village will kill you next, whether soldiers will come through and burn your home, whether you'll be conscripted and sent to die in a war you don't understand, fighting for lords you've never met. This wasn't occasional stress. This was the baseline of existence. Every single day brought with it the possibility of catastrophic loss. And there was nothing you could do to guarantee your safety. You couldn't work harder to ensure your crops would grow. A drought or flood could destroy everything regardless of your efforts. You couldn't save money for emergencies because you had no money to save. You lived hand to mouth, converting your labor directly into the bare minimum needed for survival. You couldn't move to a safer area because everywhere was dangerous, and besides, you had no means of relocating. The psychological literature on trauma and chronic stress suggests that prolonged exposure to inescapable threats fundamentally changes the brain. People develop hypervigilance, a state of constant alertness to danger that never switches off. They may become emotionally numb as a defense mechanism, detaching from feelings that would otherwise be overwhelming. They might develop what we would now recognize as depression anxiety disorders, or PTSD. But none of these conditions were understood or treated during the Three Kingdoms period. You would simply be considered weak, lazy, or possessed by evil spirits. Grief was universal. Remember that life expectancy was short and child mortality was high. If you lived to be 30 years old, you would almost certainly have watched multiple siblings die in childhood. Your parents would likely die before you reached middle age. If you married and had children, you would probably lose at least one or two of them before they reached adulthood. Your spouse might die young from disease or childbirth. Death was not an occasional visitor, but a constant presence in your life. How do human beings cope with such pervasive loss? Historical records suggest that people in pre-modern societies developed cultural mechanisms for dealing with grief. Elaborate funeral rites, ancestor veneration, religious or philosophical frameworks that gave meaning to suffering. Confucianism emphasized duty and filial piety, providing a structure for grieving parents and children. Taoism offered a philosophy of acceptance and flow with natural forces. Buddhism, which was spreading through China during this period, taught that suffering was universal and that attachment led to pain. These philosophical and religious systems could provide comfort, but they couldn't eliminate the fundamental anguish of losing people you loved. Parents who buried children experienced a grief that transcended culture and time period. Widows who lost their partners faced not only emotional devastation, but also economic and social precarity. Orphaned children had to navigate a world that provided little support for those without family protection. The lack of control over your own life would eat away at your sense of self. We derive so much of our identity and self-worth from our choices. What we do for work, where we live, who we love. But in Three Kingdoms China, you had almost no choices. Your occupation was determined by birth. You would live where you were born, or maybe move to a nearby village if you married. You might have some say in choosing a spouse, but even that was heavily influenced by family considerations and economic factors. Your children would follow the same path you followed, and theirs would follow them. This lack of agency could induce a kind of learned helplessness. Why try to improve your situation when the system is designed to keep you in place? Why hope for a better future when experience teaches that hoping just makes disappointment more painful? Many people probably adopted a fatalistic worldview, accepting their suffering as inevitable and focusing on day-to-day survival rather than dreaming of change. And yet, humans are remarkably resilient. Even in the darkest circumstances, people find moments of joy, connection, and meaning. Parents loved their children and found happiness in their laughter. Communities celebrated festivals that briefly lifted the burden of daily struggle. People formed friendships, fell in love, created art and music, told stories. The human capacity to find light even in darkness is one of our most extraordinary characteristics. But that resilience doesn't mean the suffering wasn't real or that it wouldn't affect you. A modern person, accustomed to relative comfort, safety, and agency, would likely find the psychological adjustment to Three Kingdoms life as difficult as the physical adjustment. Depression would be almost inevitable. The constant fear, the helplessness, the grief would be crushing. And with no support systems, no therapy, no medication, no real understanding of mental health, you would simply have to endure. Some people wouldn't be able to endure. Suicide, while condemned by Confucian philosophy, certainly occurred. Records mention people taking their own lives in despair or as a way to preserve honor in defeat. How many more contemplated it, but carried on simply because there was no other choice? Perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of life in this era was the absence of hope for systemic change. In our modern world, even when we face injustice or hardship, we can imagine ways things might improve. We can advocate for policy changes, organize for better conditions, or at least believe that future generations might have it better. But in the rigid, hierarchical society of Three Kingdoms China, change seemed impossible. The social order felt permanent and immutable. You would live as your parents lived, and your children would live the same way, and so on forever. That sense of futility, of being trapped in a situation that could never improve, would be soul-crushing. Technology and weapons, the tools of destruction. Before we conclude, we need to talk about the technology and weapons that defined warfare during the Three Kingdoms period, because understanding these gives us a fuller picture of just how brutal combat was and how dangerous the era truly was. The Three Kingdoms period was actually a time of significant technological innovation, driven largely by the demands of constant warfare. But don't imagine sleek modern weapons or protective gear. The technology of this era, while impressive for its time, would seem primitive and terrifying by modern standards. Let's start with weaponry. The primary weapons of Three Kingdoms armies were variations on designs that had been used for centuries: swords, spears, halberds, and bows. But the metallurgy had improved significantly. Iron weapons were common by this period, having largely replaced bronze. Steel production techniques were advancing, allowing for stronger, sharper blades. But even the best weapons of this era would be crude by modern standards, uneven in quality, prone to breaking or bending in combat, requiring constant maintenance and sharpening. The sword, or jian, was considered a noble weapon, associated with scholars and officers. These were straight, double-edged blades, typically between 2 and 3 feet long. They required significant skill to use effectively and were expensive to produce, making them relatively rare among common soldiers. The dao, a single-edged saber or sword, was more common and practical for military use. It was cheaper to produce, easier to wield, and effective for slashing attacks. Spears and polearms were the backbone of infantry warfare. A spear was essentially a wooden shaft with a metal point, simple to produce and effective in massed formation. Soldiers could be trained relatively quickly to stand in formation and thrust their spears at approaching enemies. Pole arms like the halberd, which combined a spear point with an axe blade and sometimes a hook for pulling riders off horses, were more complex but devastating in the hands of skilled warriors. Archery was crucial to Three Kingdoms warfare, and this period saw important developments in bow technology. The composite bow, made from layers of different materials like wood, bamboo, horn, and sinew, was already well established. These bows were powerful, with effective ranges of over 100 yards in skilled hands. Arrows were tipped with metal points that could penetrate armor at close range. An arrow wound, even if it didn't kill immediately, was likely to cause infection and death later. But the most significant weapons development of this era was the crossbow, all new. China had been using crossbows for centuries, but the Three Kingdoms period saw improvements to the repeating crossbow. Traditional sources credit Shu Chancellor Zhuge Liang with refining this device, though the exact nature of his contribution is debated among historians. The repeating crossbow could hold multiple bolts in a magazine and fire them in rapid succession by working a lever. While less powerful and accurate than a conventional bow, the repeating crossbow had two major advantages. It required minimal training to use, and it could maintain a high rate of fire. A formation of soldiers with repeating crossbows could unleash a devastating barrage of projectiles. Armor existed, but was far from universal. Metal armor, whether iron or steel, was expensive and primarily worn by officers and elite troops. Common soldiers might wear leather armor or padded cloth armor, which provided some protection against cuts, but was less effective against crushing blows or arrows. Many soldiers had no armor at all, relying on wooden shields for defense. Horse armor existed for cavalry, but was rare, mentioned in historical accounts as something remarkable rather than standard. Siege warfare technology was particularly brutal. Chinese engineers had developed sophisticated techniques for attacking fortified cities. They built siege towers, tall wooden structures on wheels that could be rolled up to city walls, allowing attackers to reach the top of the fortifications. They dug tunnels under walls, shoring them up with wooden posts, then lighting fires to collapse the tunnels and bring down the walls above. They used catapults and trebuchets to hurl stones, fire, or diseased corpses over walls into besieged cities. Defending a besieged city was a nightmare. Once surrounded, the defenders had to rely on stored food and water, which inevitably ran out. Disease spread rapidly in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Defenders dropped stones, boiling oil or excrement on attackers below. But sieges often lasted months, and the longer they went on, the more desperate conditions became inside. Historical accounts describe people in besieged cities resorting to eating leather, rats, tree bark, and in extreme cases, each other. Naval warfare was particularly important in the southern kingdoms, where rivers and lakes served as major transportation routes. Chinese shipbuilding technology was advanced, producing vessels ranging from small patrol boats to large warships that could carry hundreds of soldiers. The most famous naval engagement of the period, the Battle of Red Cliffs, demonstrated how devastating fire could be as a naval weapon. Zhou Yu's strategy of using fire ships, vessels loaded with flammable materials and set ablaze before being directed at enemy fleets, annihilated Cao Cao's armada. The invention or improvement of certain technologies had impacts beyond warfare. The wheelbarrow, which may have been invented or significantly refined during this period, revolutionized the transport of goods and materials. Historical accounts credit Zhuge Liang with creating an improved transport device called the wooden ox and flowing horse. Though what exactly these devices were remains a subject of scholarly debate. They may have been advanced wheelbarrows or some other form of human-powered cart. What we can say with certainty is that improved transport technology allowed a single person to move loads that would otherwise require multiple people or pack animals, improving efficiency in both military logistics and civilian agriculture. The south-pointing chariot, a mechanical device that used a differential gear system to maintain a pointer facing south, regardless of how the chariot turned, represented remarkable engineering sophistication. It served as a directional aid for armies marching through unfamiliar territory. The mechanism required precision metalworking and an understanding of gears that was impressive for the era. Medical technology and knowledge also advanced during this period, partly in response to the enormous casualties of warfare. The legendary physician Hua Tuo, who lived during the late Han and early Three Kingdoms period, was said to have performed complex surgeries, including abdominal operations, using an anesthetic mixture he called mafeisan, possibly containing cannabis and other herbs. Whether all the stories about Hua Tuo are true is debatable. He became a semi-legendary figure, but they reflect genuine advances in medical understanding. Zhang Zhongjing, another physician of this era, wrote the Shanghan Lun, or Treatise on Cold Damage and Miscellaneous Diseases, which became one of the foundational texts of Chinese medicine. The work systematically described symptoms, diagnosis, and treatments for a wide range of conditions, representing a major step forward in medical literature. But here's what's important to understand. Despite these technological advances, life during the Three Kingdoms period remained brutal and dangerous. The weapons were designed to maim and kill human beings efficiently. The siege technologies prolonged conflicts and maximized suffering. The medical advances, while significant, couldn't save most people who suffered serious injuries or illnesses. Technology amplified the scale of destruction without providing corresponding protections for human life. If you found yourself conscripted into one of the Three Kingdoms' armies, you would be issued weapons that were crude by modern standards, given minimal training, and sent into battle where the chances of death or serious injury were high. If you survived combat, you might die from infected wounds, disease spreading through the camp, or starvation when supply lines broke down. If you participated in a siege, either as attacker or defender, you would witness and participate in horrors that would haunt you forever, assuming you lived long enough to be haunted. The reality is that all the technological sophistication of this era was directed toward making warfare more effective, not toward protecting human life or improving living conditions for ordinary people. The repeating crossbow was developed to kill more enemies more quickly, not to plow fields more efficiently. The siege towers were built to conquer cities, not to house the homeless. The medical advances helped keep soldiers alive long enough to fight more battles, but did little for peasants dying of starvation or disease in their villages. This is what made the Three Kingdoms period so deadly. It combined technological sophistication with political instability, creating a situation where the tools of destruction were constantly improving while the social structures that might have protected people were collapsing. It was a perfect storm of danger, and you, as a person from the modern era, would have no defense against it. Conclusion: why you really wouldn't last a day. Let's be honest about what we've explored here. We've journeyed through one of the darkest periods in Chinese history, examining the realities that lurked behind the romantic legends. And the conclusion is unavoidable. If you, with your modern sensibilities, modern immune system, and modern expectations, were suddenly transported back to the Three Kingdoms period, your chances of survival would be virtually zero. You wouldn't last a day. Not really. Within hours, you'd be struggling with the most basic necessities. That glass of clean water you take for granted? Gone. The safe food supply? Gone. The comfortable bed, the climate control, the security of knowing that if something goes wrong, you can call for help. All gone. You'd be thrust into a world of constant danger, grinding poverty, disease, violence, and suffering that would overwhelm even the toughest modern person. Within days, assuming you even survived that long, your body would begin breaking down. Contaminated water would give you dysentery. The unfamiliar diet and lack of proper nutrition would leave you weak and sick. Without antibiotics, any small cut or infection could become life-threatening. The back-breaking labor would destroy muscles and joints accustomed to ergonomic workspaces and 8-hour workdays. You'd be covered in insect bites, developing skin conditions, losing weight rapidly despite constant hunger. Within weeks, if disease didn't kill you, the psychological toll would become unbearable. The constant fear, the absolute lack of control over your circumstances, the realization that there was no escape and no hope of improvement. It would break most people. You'd watch others die around you and know that you were likely next. The grinding daily struggle for survival, with no prospect of anything better, would drain away your will to continue. And that's assuming you weren't conscripted into one of the armies, where your chances of survival would be even worse, or caught in a battle between warlords, or seized by bandits, or struck by one of the epidemic diseases that swept through the population, or simply starved to death during a famine. The numbers tell the story most clearly. China's registered population dropped from approximately 58 million, according to Han's census records, to 16 million, according to Jin's census records, during the century encompassing the late Han Dynasty and the Three Kingdoms period. While these census figures reflect not only deaths, but also breakdown in record-keeping, displacement, and populations living outside imperial control, the scale of demographic catastrophe remains staggering. That represents one of the greatest demographic disruptions in human history, comparable to the devastation of World War II or the Mongol invasions. Those millions reflected in the census decline weren't just statistics. They represented individuals like you and me, farmers who wanted nothing more than to grow enough food to feed their families, children who died before experiencing more than a few years of life, parents who watched their babies starve and could do nothing, soldiers who died far from home in wars they didn't understand. Women who endured brutality and hardship we can barely imagine. Every one of those millions had dreams, fears, loves, and losses. What makes the Three Kingdoms period particularly fascinating from a historical perspective is the tension between the romanticized version and the brutal reality. The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, that famous Ming Dynasty novel, portrays this era as a time of heroes and grand adventures. And yes, there were remarkable individuals. Cao Cao's strategic brilliance, Liu Bei's charisma and loyalty, Sun Quan's careful statesmanship, Zhuge Liang's legendary cleverness. These were real people who left real legacies. But for every famous warlord or strategist, there were tens of thousands of ordinary people whose names we'll never know, who suffered and died in the conflicts these great men created. The epic battles we read about with admiration were horror shows for the soldiers who fought in them and the civilians caught in their path. The political intrigues were amusing intellectual puzzles for the participants, but had devastating consequences for populations who had to endure whoever won. Modern people, especially those of us living in developed nations, exist in an unprecedented bubble of safety and comfort. We have conquered most infectious diseases through vaccines and antibiotics. We have abundant food supplies and the infrastructure to distribute them. We have legal systems that, however imperfectly, provide some protection against violence and exploitation. We have technology that makes labor easier and life more comfortable. We live longer, healthier, and safer lives than any previous generation in human history. Stepping out of that bubble and into the Three Kingdoms period would be like stepping from a warm, lighted house into a dark wilderness full of predators. Everything familiar would be stripped away. Everything we depend on would be gone. We would be reduced to the most basic struggle for survival, with the odds stacked overwhelmingly against us. And yet, billions of our ancestors did survive such conditions. They endured hardships we can barely comprehend. They carried on in the face of suffering that would break us. They found ways to love, to hope, to create meaning in the meaningless situations. The fact that we exist at all is proof that they succeeded, at least long enough to produce the next generation. That's worth remembering and honoring. The people of the Three Kingdoms period were no less intelligent, no less capable, no less human than we are. They simply had the misfortune to live in one of history's darkest chapters. Their resilience in the face of such overwhelming adversity is genuinely remarkable. But it doesn't mean we should romanticize their suffering. Imagine we could have done better in their place. The comfortable truth is that we are products of our time, shaped by the advantages we've inherited. Those advantages have made us, in many ways, soft, less able to endure hardship, less equipped to survive without modern support systems. And there's no shame in that. It's a testament to how much progress we've made. So tonight, as you lie in your comfortable bed, in your secure home, with clean water available at the turn of a tap and food waiting in your refrigerator, take a moment to appreciate what you have. Appreciate the countless generations who survived impossible conditions so that you could be here. Appreciate the vaccines, the antibiotics, the rule of law, the stable government, the grocery stores, the heating and air conditioning, the toilets, the soap, the dentists, the doctors, the sheer accumulated knowledge and infrastructure that keeps you safe and comfortable. Because in the Three Kingdoms period, you wouldn't have any of that. And you really, truly wouldn't last a day. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's darkest chapters. If you found this exploration of the past interesting or enlightening, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. It helps more people discover these stories. And if you have suggestions for other historical periods you'd like us to explore, leave them in the comments below. Until next time, sleep well and be grateful you're here in the present rather than there in the past. Good night.